The unfortunate incident. The twin moons of Velthoria shone brightly over the bustling capital city. The grand marketplace, a maze of colorful stalls and floating lanterns, was alive with alien voices, the scent of exotic spices, and the hum of advanced technology. It was Ethan Carter's first time on this planet, and he was in awe. As a human diplomat, his job was to negotiate trade agreements, but right now, he was just another outsider in a sea of alien life. Velthorians were a proud feline-like species, their sleek fur shining under the artificial lights. They moved with grace, their long tails swaying behind them like banners of royalty. Ethan had read about their customs, but experiencing them firsthand was something else entirely. He walked carefully, making sure not to bump into anyone. The marketplace was crowded, and Velthorians were known for their short tempers. The last thing he wanted was to offend someone by accident, but fate had other plans. Ethan turned a corner, his attention drawn to a hovering food cart selling steaming golden pastries. He took a step forward, reaching for his translator device to ask about the strange delicacy. And that's when it happened. His boot landed on something soft. A sharp gasp filled the air. Ethan felt something move beneath his foot, like a thick rope pulling away in pain. He barely had time to register what had happened before a loud, furious voice cut through the noise. "You dare!" The marketplace fell silent. Velthorians froze, their feline eyes wide in shock. The air became heavy with tension, and Ethan's stomach dropped. He looked down and saw a long, golden tail retreating from under his boot. A Velthorian woman stood before him, her piercing emerald eyes burning with rage. Her royal blue robes shimmered with golden embroidery, and an ornate silver headpiece rested between her pointed ears. She wasn't just any Velthorian. She was someone important. Ethan lifted his foot instantly, his heart hammering in his chest. I'm sorry. It was an accident. But the damage was done. The woman's expression darkened. Velthorians valued their tails more than anything. Touching one without permission was an insult. Stepping on one, that was beyond unforgivable. Guards appeared out of nowhere, their weapons aimed at Ethan's chest. "Wait, let's not." Ethan started, raising his hands in surrender. The woman lifted her chin. Her tail flicked angrily behind her, though Ethan could see she was still holding it in pain. "You ignorant offworlder," she spat. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Ethan swallowed hard. "I swear, it was an accident." A low growl rumbled from the crowd. Accident or not, the Velthorians were not a forgiving people. One of the guards stepped forward, his silver armor gleaming. "By the laws of Velthoria, an offense against the royal house is punishable by exile, imprisonment, or a life-binding vow." Royal house. Ethan's eyes widened. Who exactly had he stepped on? The woman crossed her arms, her gaze filled with fury and calculation. "I am Princess Silvera, heir to the Velthorian throne," she said coldly. "And you, human, have committed the gravest insult to my honor." Ethan felt his knees go weak. Of all the tales in the entire galaxy, he had stepped on a princess's. The crowd murmured in hushed tones. Some looked at him with pity, others with amusement. A few seemed eager to see him punished. One of the guards turned to the princess. "What shall be done, Your Highness?" Silvera's eyes narrowed as she studied Ethan. She could have him thrown into the dungeons. She could demand a public apology, though it wouldn't be enough. No, this crime was too great. There was only one way to restore her honor. She stepped forward, her voice ringing through the marketplace. "By the ancient laws of Velthoria," she declared, "this human has dishonored a member of the royal bloodline." She paused, letting the words sink in. Then, with a slow, deliberate breath, she delivered the sentence. "He will marry me." Ethan almost choked on his own breath. The marketplace exploded into chaos. Velthorians gasped. Some whispered excitedly. Others looked horrified. A human marrying the princess. It was unheard of. Ethan stared at her in disbelief. Wait, what? Silvera's cold smirk sent a chill down his spine. You heard me, offworlder. If you refuse, you will be exiled, imprisoned, or worse. Ethan's mind raced. This had to be some kind of joke, right? Some ancient, outdated tradition no one actually followed anymore. But as he looked at the deadly serious expressions of the guards, the crowd, and, most of all, the princess, he knew one thing for certain. This was real. He had just stepped on an alien princess's tail, and now he was honor-bound to marry her. Ethan let out a nervous laugh, but no one else found it funny. This was not how he expected his diplomatic mission to go. The trial of honor. The great hall of Velthoria's palace loomed over Ethan like an unshakable mountain, carved from deep violet stone. Its towering pillars and glowing crystal chandeliers made it clear this was not a place for mercy. Ethan stood in the center, surrounded by guards in gleaming silver armor. Their feline eyes watched his every move. He wasn't a prisoner, not yet, but he might as well have been. At the far end of the hall, seated on an elaborate golden throne, King Velrax, Silvera's father, studied him with a cold, calculating gaze. His fur was streaked with silver, his robes draped in royal insignias. Beside him stood Princess Silvera, her arms crossed, her tail still twitching from the earlier incident. Ethan took a slow breath. This was insane. One accidental misstep had landed him in the middle of an alien royal court, facing a life sentence in the form of marriage. He cleared his throat. "Your Highness," he said, looking at the king, "there has to be a misunderstanding. I meant no disrespect." The king's piercing eyes didn't waver. "Your intent is irrelevant," he said. "The law is clear." Ethan opened his mouth to protest, but Silvera cut him off. "You dishonored me, human," she said, her voice sharp. "Do you think an apology is enough?" Ethan clenched his jaw. "Where I come from, when someone makes a mistake, they make it right," he said. "But forcing someone into marriage for an accident, that's madness." The court gasped. A few murmurs spread through the room. Silvera's ears flattened, and her emerald eyes flashed dangerously. "Then perhaps you'd prefer the alternative." Ethan hesitated. "Alternative?" A new voice echoed through the chamber. "The trial of honor." The speaker was Lord Kale, the king's advisor. His fur was a sleek shade of charcoal, his golden eyes brimming with amusement. He stepped forward, his regal robes sweeping the floor. A test of strength, intelligence, and loyalty. "If you survive, you may walk away freely. If you fail—" Cal's smirk deepened. "Well, let's just say your body will be honored with a proper burial." The court laughed coldly. Ethan's stomach twisted. "Wait," he said slowly. "So if I pass this trial, I don't have to marry her?" Silvera's tail flicked. "Correct." Ethan exhaled in relief. This was his way out. He had no idea what the trial involved, but whatever it was, it had to be better than being trapped in a political marriage. "I'll do it," he said. Silvera raised an eyebrow. "You accept the trial of honor?" Ethan nodded firmly. "I accept." For a moment, there was silence. Then the king rose to his feet, his deep voice echoing through the hall. "Then let the trial of honor begin." The gauntlet of claws. Ethan stood in the middle of a colossal arena, surrounded by thousands of roaring Velthorians. The stadium stretched as far as the eye could see, its golden spires glinting under the twin moons. The trial of honor had begun, and his first challenge was about to start. A massive iron gate creaked open at the far end of the arena. Dust swirled as a Velthorian warrior stepped forward. He was huge, at least 7 feet tall, his black and gold armor gleaming under the arena lights. He carried 2 curved blades, and his sharp fangs were bared in a predatory grin. The announcer's voice boomed across the stadium. "Challenger Ethan Carter. Your opponent, Commander Xelari, undefeated champion of the Royal Guard." Ethan's pulse spiked. They expected him to fight that. A deafening horn blasted through the air. The fight had begun. Xelari charged, his feline reflexes making him a blur of motion. His blade sliced through the air, forcing Ethan to throw himself to the side. The crowd roared as Ethan barely dodged in time. Ethan scrambled to his feet, sweat beading on his forehead. He had no weapons, no armor, just his wits. Xelari struck again, his blade nicking Ethan's sleeve. Ethan knew one thing: he couldn't win by brute force. Then, an idea sparked in his mind. Velthorians fought with pride. They expected direct combat, honorable attacks. But Ethan wasn't one of them. He faked a stumble, pretending to be off balance. Xelari, seeing an opening, lunged forward for the kill. But Ethan was ready. At the last second, he dropped low, rolling beneath the warrior's strike. As Xelari overextended, Ethan grabbed a handful of sand and threw it into his opponent's eyes. Xelari roared in rage, momentarily blinded. The crowd gasped in shock. This was not honorable combat. This was tactical survival. Ethan didn't wait. He ran straight for the arena wall. The Velthorians had been too focused on brute strength to consider the obvious. The arena was climbable. With a final leap, Ethan grabbed onto the stone ledge and hauled himself up, escaping the battlefield. The horn blasted again. The announcer's voice rang out. Victory to Ethan Carter. A shocking outcome. Back in the royal stands, Princess Silvera watched with narrowed eyes. The human had won, but not by strength or skill, by outthinking the challenge. Interesting. Silvera turned to her father. He is not weak. King Velarax's expression remained unreadable. Perhaps not. But the next challenge will decide his fate. Silvera smirked. The labyrinth of shadows awaited. The labyrinth of shadows. The air inside the labyrinth of shadows was thick with an eerie silence. Unlike the roaring arena, where Ethan had barely managed to win against Xelari, this place was deathly quiet, as if the walls themselves were waiting to swallow him whole. Ethan stood at the entrance, staring at the massive stone structure before him. The labyrinth's towering walls, made of a dark, obsidian-like material, stretched high into the sky, their jagged edges cutting into the mist that curled at their base. He exhaled slowly. This was the second trial, and from what he had gathered, no outsider had ever survived it. A deep drumbeat echoed across the courtyard. Velthorian officials in ceremonial robes stood at the edges, their feline eyes glowing under the flickering torches. The king and Princess Silvera watched from a high platform, their expressions unreadable. The second trial begins now, Lord Kale announced. Challenger Ethan Carter, you will have 1 hour to navigate the labyrinth of shadows. Failure to escape in time will result in... He smiled, his sharp teeth glinting. Your permanent residence within its depths. Ethan didn't need a translator to understand that. Failing meant death. The Velthorian crowd murmured with excitement. Many believed the human's victory in the first challenge was a fluke, a lucky trick against Xelari. But here, inside the labyrinth, luck wouldn't save him. The gates groaned open, revealing a dark and twisting corridor beyond. Ethan stepped forward. The gates slammed shut behind him. The living maze. As soon as Ethan walked inside, he felt the change. The temperature dropped, and an unnatural stillness settled over the air. The walls of the labyrinth seemed to pulse, as if they were alive. He took a cautious step forward. The ground beneath his boots was smooth but cold, the walls shifting slightly, just enough to make his instincts scream that something wasn't right. Then the whispers began. A soft, hissing sound slithered through the corridors, distant at first, then growing closer. Ethan turned sharply, his heart pounding. Something moved in the darkness. A shadowy figure flickered at the edge of his vision. Tall, distorted, shifting like smoke. It had no eyes, no mouth, yet Ethan could feel it watching him. He gritted his teeth. Great, Haunted space maze. Just what I needed. But there was no time for jokes. He had 1 hour to get out. The first trap. The echoing steps. Ethan took another step forward and immediately froze. There was another set of footsteps. His own had an echo, but this one was slightly offbeat, like something was mimicking him. He spun around. Nothing. The corridor stretched behind him, empty and silent. Then he heard it again. Tap, tap, tap. Closer. A chill ran down his spine. Someone, or something, was walking when he wasn't. He needed to move. Fast. Ethan took a sharp left, then a right, trying to throw off whatever was following him. The labyrinth's walls twisted unpredictably, some passages suddenly closing behind him, others shifting into new paths. The maze was changing. He knew that stopping was not an option. The second trap. The veil of illusions. After several turns, Ethan came across something unexpected. A mirror. It was a massive floor-to-ceiling pane of glass, completely out of place in the ancient, dark stone maze. But when he looked into it, his reflection was wrong. His mirrored self wasn't mimicking his movements. Instead, it watched him with an eerie stillness. Then it spoke. "Turn left, or you will die." Ethan's blood ran cold. His reflection's mouth hadn't moved. This was another trick. The whispers returned, curling around his ears. "Turn left," they urged. "Turn left. Turn left." Ethan's fingers curled into fists. He did the opposite. He turned right, and the mirror shattered into dust. The whispers screamed in fury, but he kept running. Whatever this labyrinth was, it was trying to manipulate him. Not today. The final obstacle. The shadow beast. Ethan's muscles burned as he sprinted down the twisting corridors, dodging falling stones, disappearing pathways, and phantom hands reaching from the walls. His internal clock told him he was running out of time. Then he saw it. The exit. A massive archway of glowing blue light at the end of a long corridor. He pushed forward, only to hear a deep, guttural growl behind him. He turned. A creature emerged from the shadows. It was massive, at least 10 feet tall, its form shifting like black mist, but with razor-sharp claws and glowing violet eyes. Its movements were unnatural, glitching through the air as if it was flickering between dimensions. Ethan didn't think. He ran. The beast let out a piercing shriek, lunging forward with inhuman speed. Ethan barely dodged, diving under its massive claws as they tore through the stone walls like paper. He was feet from the exit. The creature lunged again, this time faster. Ethan grabbed a shard of broken stone and threw it at the nearest torch. Fire exploded, casting bright light into the corridor. The beast screamed, recoiling from the glow. That was his chance. Ethan launched himself forward and burst through the exit. The aftermath. Ethan collapsed onto the stone floor outside, panting, his heart hammering like a war drum. The Velthorian crowd was silent. No human had ever passed the labyrinth of shadows. Princess Silvera's lips parted slightly, her expression unreadable. King Velarax leaned forward. Fascinating. Lord Kale, for the first time, looked unsettled. Ethan forced himself to his feet, ignoring the burning in his muscles. He lifted his chin and met the king's gaze. "I believe that's 2 challenges I've won now." Silvera smirked. "We'll see if you survive the 3rd. The next trial was waiting. The vow of truth. And this time, Ethan wouldn't just be tested physically. He would be tested to his very core. The vow of truth. The echoes of Ethan's ragged breathing faded as he stumbled out of the labyrinth of shadows, his body drenched in sweat. His muscles screamed in exhaustion, his mind still reeling from what he had just survived. The whispering voices, the shifting walls, the shadow beast, none of it felt real, yet the bruises and cuts on his arms said otherwise. And yet he had won. He forced himself to stand upright, aware that the entire Velforian court was watching him closely. The arena, once filled with jeering spectators, was now silent. No human had ever made it this far. But Ethan wasn't celebrating yet. He knew what was coming next. At the far end of the courtyard, King Velrax and Princess Silvera remained seated on their elevated thrones. Lord Kale, the king's advisor, had lost his smug grin. His golden eyes flickered with something new, uncertainty. Silvera, however, looked intrigued, amused, even. Ethan wiped his forehead, taking a deep breath. "All right," he called out, his voice hoarse. "What's next?" The king's deep voice rumbled through the air like distant thunder. "The vow of truth." A hush fell over the court. Ethan straightened his back, hiding his exhaustion. He had no idea what this trial involved, but if it was anything like the last two, he was in for another nightmare. Lord Kale stepped forward, his hands clasped behind his back. "The vow of truth is a sacred test," he said, his voice smooth but sharp. "It is not a physical endurance like the first two trials. This test is one of spirit, mind, and honesty." Ethan frowned. "You're gonna make me take a lie detector test." Several Velforians hissed in offense. Cal's expression remained neutral. "No, human. You will face the Oracle of Velforia." The crowd murmured. The Oracle. Ethan had no idea what that was, but judging by the tension in the air, this was no ordinary test. Kale gestured, and suddenly, the ground before Ethan trembled. A massive circular stone platform slowly rose from the earth, its surface etched with glowing runes that pulsed like a heartbeat. At its center, a floating sphere of golden energy materialized, flickering like a dying sun. Ethan stared at it warily. "And what exactly does this oracle do?" Silvera finally spoke. "It will read the depths of your mind, your heart, your intentions. It will see your soul, human." Her voice was quieter than before, almost curious. "If it deems you unworthy, it will consume you." Ethan blinked. "Consume me?" Kale smirked. "You will cease to exist." Fantastic. The test begins. The moment Ethan stepped onto the platform, his body went rigid. The air around him shifted, growing thicker, heavier, as if an invisible force was pressing down on his chest. The golden sphere of energy flared, expanding until it hovered inches from his face. A voice, not spoken, but heard directly in his mind, echoed inside him. "You stand before the oracle. Speak your truth, or be unmade." Ethan's heartbeat pounded in his ears. He had no idea what this thing was doing, but he could feel it inside his thoughts, pulling at memories, shifting through his past, like flipping pages of a book. It was searching. Then the oracle's voice rang again. "Who are you?" A simple question. But Ethan felt the weight behind it. This wasn't just asking for his name. It wanted the truth. He swallowed. "I'm Ethan Carter, a human diplomat." The oracle pulsed. "A diplomat. Yet you fight like a warrior." A memory flashed in Ethan's mind. His desperate battle in the arena. Outmaneuvering Xelari. Ethan exhaled. "I never wanted to fight. I only fought because I had to." The oracle pulsed brighter. The pressure increased, as if it was testing his resolve. "Do you wish to leave this place?" Ethan hesitated. That was the logical answer, wasn't it? Of course he wanted to leave. He never asked for any of this. He never wanted to be dragged into an alien marriage over an accident. And yet, his eyes flickered toward Princess Silvera, who watched him with an unreadable expression. Something had changed. At first, she had treated him like a burden, a nuisance. But now she was studying him, not as an enemy, but as something unexpected. Did he want to leave? Maybe, but something in his gut told him that his journey here wasn't finished yet. He took a slow breath. "I don't know." The oracle flared brightly. "Truth." The Velforian court murmured in surprise. Kel's smug grin was gone. Ethan swallowed hard. "That's good, right? The oracle was silent for a moment. Then it spoke again, its voice harsher now. "Do you seek power?" Ethan's brow furrowed. "No." A sharp pulse. The oracle flashed violently, and suddenly, Ethan felt an overwhelming force crush into his skull. He staggered, his vision warping. A memory surfaced, unbidden. A younger Ethan, a war zone. His first diplomatic mission gone wrong. He had begged to do more, to have the power to change things, to protect people, to stop innocent lives from being lost. He had wanted power once. The oracle's voice boomed. "You lie." Pain exploded in Ethan's head. He collapsed to his knees, gasping. The crowd watched in tense silence. Silvera's tail twitched sharply. Cal's smirk returned. Ethan gritted his teeth. "Fine. I wanted power once, okay. But not for the sake of power. I wanted to help people, to make a difference. That's all." The oracle. "This is an insult to our traditions. We should have let the oracle judge him unworthy." Ethan clenched his jaw. So that had been the plan. They had hoped the oracle would break him. But it hadn't. King Velarax remained silent for a long moment, letting the outrage die down. Then his piercing gaze fell upon Ethan once more. "You have passed the trials," he said. "Velthorian law is absolute. Your fate is sealed." Ethan exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand down his face. "You say that like it's a reward." Silvera snorted softly, but when Ethan glanced at her, she quickly masked her expression, returning to her usual unreadable stare. Cal wasn't done. "My king," he said, with respect, "this decision will not be accepted lightly. There are those among us woe." Velarax lifted a single clawed hand. Silence. Cal shut his mouth, though his tail lashed in irritation. "I am not blind, Lord Cal," the king said, his voice cold and sharp as steel. "There are those who will resist this, but let them try." His gaze flickered toward the nobles in the crowd. "I am king, and my word is law." The nobles bowed their heads, though Ethan could see the tension in their shoulders. They were not pleased. Ethan had seen enough political games to know that some of them wouldn't just let this happen. The real danger was just beginning. The engagement ritual. The engagement ceremony was announced immediately. Velthorian customs dictated that the couple must publicly acknowledge their bond, followed by an official ceremony where their names would be bound in the royal archives for all time. And just like that, Ethan found himself standing beside Silvera in a grand ceremonial hall, surrounded by nobles, warriors, and advisors, all watching with barely concealed disdain. The hall's golden pillars stretched toward the ceiling, where intricate designs of Velthorian history were carved into the stone. At the center of the chamber, an ancient relic stood upon an altar, a glowing crystal sphere known as the Bondstone. Ethan stared at it. "Please don't tell me I have to stick my hand in that thing." Silvera finally spoke, her voice edged with amusement. "No, you only have to place your palm upon it." Ethan relaxed, only slightly. A priestess, her fur silvered with age, stepped forward. "Princess Silvera," she said formally, "do you accept this bond?" Silvera, ever the composed royal, lifted her chin. "I do." The priestess turned to Ethan. "Ethan Carter, do you accept this bond?" Ethan's pulse pounded in his ears. He had no choice, but something in Silvera's eyes warned him. This wasn't just about the bond. This was about survival. He set his jaw. "I do." As soon as their hands touched the bondstone, the chamber filled with light. The crystal flared, glowing with golden energy that pulsed in time with their heartbeats. It was done. They were bound. The assassination attempt. That night, Ethan barely had time to process what had happened before a dagger nearly took his life. The attack came in the dead of night. Ethan had been led to his new chambers, an ornate yet coldly furnished room within the royal palace. He was just about to collapse onto the massive bed when his instincts screamed. A shadow moved near the window, a flash of silver, A blade. Ethan ducked just in time. The dagger whizzed past his ear, embedding itself in the wooden wall behind him. He didn't hesitate. Years of training as a diplomat and surviving hostile encounters kicked in. He rolled off the bed, snatching up a nearby decorative metal staff just as the assassin lunged at him. Ethan blocked the attack, twisting the staff to knock the attacker off balance. They hissed, a Velthorian, clad in dark, shadowy armor. Before Ethan could react, the assassin struck again, their claws swiping toward his throat. But then, a blur of motion. The assassin jerked backward with a snarl, blood dripping from a fresh wound across their chest. Silvera stood behind them, her blade gleaming with fresh crimson. Her emerald eyes blazed with fury. The assassin hissed, then vanished into the darkness, retreating through the window before the guards could arrive. Silvera turned to Ethan, her expression unreadable. "I had a feeling someone would try something." Ethan panted, still gripping the staff. "You saved me." Silvera sheathed her weapon. "Don't get used to it." Ethan let out a breathless laugh. "I didn't think you liked me." She tilted her head, studying him for a long moment. Then she smirked. "I don't." But the way she said it, it didn't sound entirely true. The rising tension. The attack proved what Ethan already knew. Not everyone was willing to accept this bond. The political storm had only begun. Velthorian factions had divided opinions. Some saw the bond as an opportunity, a chance to forge new alliances with humanity. Others saw it as an insult to their traditions, one that needed to be corrected by any means necessary. And Lord Kull, he was watching, waiting, calculating. As Ethan and Silvera stood before the court the next day, he could feel it, the war in the shadows. He wasn't just fighting for his freedom anymore. He was fighting to stay alive. The final betrayal. The royal palace of Velthoria was an architectural marvel, a fortress built from the bones of fallen asteroids and polished with gold and obsidian. Its towering spires pierced the sky like sharpened blades, a reminder that this was a kingdom ruled by strength, tradition, and power. Ethan had spent barely 2 days as Silvera's official fiancé, and already he felt like a man walking on thin ice above a frozen abyss. The assassination attempt had only been the beginning. Now something darker was brewing. The nobles had grown silent. The Velthorian warriors, once roaring with arrogance, now watched him with careful eyes. The advisors, especially Lord Kull, had taken to whispered conversations behind closed doors. It wasn't just about whether a human could marry a princess. Something deeper was at play. And Ethan had the terrible feeling that he was running out of time to figure it out. The royal banquet. A trap in disguise. That evening, Ethan found himself seated at the Grand Royal Banquet, an event held in honor of the historic union between Velthoria and humanity. The banquet hall was a masterpiece of power and elegance, lined with glowing crystal chandeliers and a massive circular table where only the highest-ranking nobles and warriors sat. Silvera sat beside him, as poised as ever, her expression unreadable. Her clawed fingers traced the rim of her wine goblet, a subtle gesture that Ethan had learned meant she was deep in thought. Cain Velarax sat at the head of the table, his golden eyes calculating, as if watching a battle unfold before him. And across from Ethan, Lord Kull smiled. Not the kind of smile that expressed warmth or approval. The kind of smile that said checkmate. Ethan tensed. Something was about to happen. The servants arrived, setting down golden plates of exotic dishes, roasted meat from creatures he didn't recognize, vibrant fruits that shimmered under the light, and a crystal decanter of royal wine. Kull lifted his goblet. "A toast," he said, his voice silken and confident. "To the unity of 2 worlds, may it be everlasting." The nobles raised their glasses. Ethan hesitated. His instincts screamed at him. His gaze flickered to Silvera. She hadn't touched her goblet yet. She was watching him, waiting. He glanced back at Kull, at the satisfied gleam in his eyes. And that's when Ethan knew. The wine was poisoned. The choice that changed everything. Ethan had two choices: drink and die. That was what Cal wanted, a diplomatic tragedy that could be blamed on unknown enemies. Refuse and reveal that he knew, which meant exposing himself as a direct threat to Cal's plans. The room was silent as Ethan's fingers hovered over the goblet. Then he made his decision. He lifted the goblet, but instead of drinking, he turned to Cal. "To unity," Ethan said, his voice calm but sharp as a blade. He held out the goblet. "Why don't you take the first sip?" Cal's smile froze. The nobles exchanged looks. The tension in the air thickened like a storm. Cal's fingers tightened around his goblet. His golden eyes flashed, just for a second, with something Ethan recognized instantly. Panic. Xelari moved. Faster than anyone could react, she grabbed Ethan's goblet and hurled it across the room. The crystal shattered against the marble floor, the wine hissing as it melted through the stone like acid. Gasps filled the hall. Ethan stood. Cal did too. His mask of politeness had cracked, but he was a master of deception. He smoothed his expression, tilting his head. "A terrible mistake, I'm sure." Xelari's voice was deadly quiet. "Mistakes don't dissolve solid rock." The nobles murmured, their eyes flickering between Ethan, Cal, and the king. Ethan locked eyes with Cal. This was war now. The king's judgment. Velarax rose from his throne, and the hall fell deathly silent. Ethan had seen many rulers in his time, but none carried the sheer weight of command like Velthoria's king. His golden eyes burned with undeniable authority, and when he spoke, it was like thunder rolling across the skies. "There is treachery in my court," he said. Not a question. A statement. Cal remained perfectly still. Ethan expected the king to demand Cal's immediate execution, but instead, Velarax turned to Xelari. "You have chosen this human as your mate," he said. "What is your judgment?" Xelari stared at her father. Ethan felt the shift in the air. This wasn't just about him. This was a test. The king was forcing Xelari to prove her claim. If she hesitated, if she faltered, then this union would be meaningless. Xelari's emerald eyes hardened. She turned to Cal. "I claim his treason by the laws of the blade right." The room exploded into murmurs. Ethan blinked. The blade right. Cal's face finally cracked. His pupils dilated in shock. "No," he said, his voice shaking with anger. "You wouldn't. I would." Xelari stood, her every movement carrying the undeniable authority of a princess. "By the ancient laws, I challenge Lord Cal to a duel of honor." Ethan barely stopped his jaw from hitting the floor. Cal's tail lashed. "You would fight me over a human." Xelari's voice was calm, deadly. "I would fight you," she said, "because you are a coward and a traitor." Cal's expression darkened. The duel was set. A night before war. Later that night, Ethan found Xelari on the royal balcony, staring at the twin moons. He approached carefully. That was bold. Xelari didn't look at him. It was necessary. Ethan leaned against the railing. "You didn't have to do that." Her tail flicked, and finally she turned to him. "Yes, I did." Her gaze softened, just slightly. "You do not yet understand my world, human. But you are part of it now." Ethan exhaled. "And if you lose?" Xelari's expression didn't waver. "I won't." For the first time since he met her, Ethan believed her. But deep in his gut, he knew Cal would not fight fairly. Tomorrow, there would be blood. And if Xelari fell, Ethan would be next. The duel for honor. The sun had barely risen over Velthoria's capital, but the royal arena was already filled with thousands of spectators. The air crackled with tension, every noble, warrior, and citizen waiting for the moment when blood would be spilled. In the center of the massive Colosseum, Princess Xelari stood tall, clad in ceremonial black and gold armor, her twin curved blades resting in her hands. Her emerald eyes gleamed with fierce determination. Across from her, Lord Kale adjusted his grip on a wickedly sharp two-handed glaive, its blade etched with ancient runes. Ethan stood at the royal platform, his jaw tight. Silvera had insisted he stay out of this fight. "If I back down now," she had told him the night before, "I will lose everything. My honor, my throne, and your life." So Ethan had swallowed his protests. But as he watched Cal's calculating smirk, he knew this was not a fair fight. Kale wasn't just fighting for his own survival. He was fighting to silence the only two people who stood in the way of his ambitions, Silvera and Ethan. The ceremonial gong rang, signaling the start of the duel, and Kale struck first. The Battle of Blades. Kale moved like a shadow of death, his glaive sweeping in a deadly arc, its blade slicing through the air with terrifying speed. Silvera danced backward, dodging by a hair's breadth. Then she countered. Her curved swords flashed, slicing toward Cal's exposed side, but he twisted with unnatural agility, deflecting the blows with the shaft of his weapon. The arena roared with excitement. Kale smirked. "You should have stayed out of my way, princess." Silvera's only response was a flurry of lightning-fast strikes. The two warriors clashed in a brutal storm of steel, their weapons a blur. Each strike sent sparks flying, the force of their battle shaking the very ground. But Ethan could see it. Kale was stronger, his reach longer, his moves designed to wear Silvera down. And worse, Kale was playing a game. He wasn't fighting to win fairly. He was stalling, waiting for the perfect moment to cheat. The hidden betrayal. Ethan's instincts screamed at him. Something was wrong. He scanned the edges of the arena, searching the crowd. Then he saw it. A Velthorian noble, hidden among the spectators, subtly adjusting something on his wrist. A trigger. Ethan's blood ran cold. A hidden energy weapon. Kale wasn't going to fight fairly. He was going to have Silvera killed with a long-range shot. Ethan moved instantly. Without thinking, he leaped from the platform, sprinting through the stunned spectators. "Ethan!" Someone shouted, "Silvera, or maybe the king." But he didn't stop. Because in the next 3 seconds, that noble would fire a shot that would end this duel forever. And Silvera would never see it coming. The bullet that changed everything. The assassin raised his wrist, the hidden barrel glowing with energy. Ethan tackled him. The weapon fired, and instead of hitting Silvera, the energy blast tore through Cal's shoulder. The crowd gasped in shock. Cal staggered, his weapon slipping from his grip, blood pouring from the wound. Silvera, stunned for only a heartbeat, saw her opening, and struck. Her twin blades crossed in a deadly arc, slicing cleanly through Cal's armor. Cal's golden eyes widened in shock. Then he fell. The silence that followed was deafening. The judgment. Cal lay motionless on the blood-stained sand. The nobles were stunned, the warriors speechless. Then King Velrax rose from his throne. His voice boomed across the arena. "Cal has fallen," he declared, his treachery exposed. His golden eyes locked onto the nobles who had supported Cal. "And those who plotted against the crown will face judgment." The nobles bowed quickly, their fear palpable. Velrax then turned to Ethan. His gaze was unreadable, human. Ethan, still panting from the fight, looked up. "Yeah." The king was silent for a moment. Then, to everyone's shock, he inclined his head. A warrior's instincts, a noble's courage. His voice carried across the crowd. "Perhaps my daughter has made the right choice." Silvera, still gripping her blood-stained blades, flicked her tail. A victorious smirk tugged at her lips. Ethan exhaled. Finally, it was over. The aftermath. A new beginning. That night, the stars shone brighter than ever over Velthoria. Ethan stood on the palace balcony, the cool breeze soothing his exhausted muscles. He had survived. Against all odds, He had passed the trials, exposed treachery, and saved Silvera's life. And yet, his future was still uncertain. Silvera stepped beside him, her armor replaced with a simple yet elegant royal robe. She studied him. "You look troubled." Ethan chuckled. "I was supposed to be a diplomat, not whatever this is." Silvera's emerald eyes gleamed with amusement. "A hero." Ethan snorted. "More like accidentally stepped on an alien princess's tail and ended up in a political nightmare." Silvera's lips curved into a smirk. "It seems fate has a strange sense of humor." They stood there in silence for a moment, the weight of everything settling between them. Then she spoke again. "So, will you stay?" Ethan turned to her, really looking at her. She wasn't just the fierce princess who had nearly had him executed. She wasn't just the warrior who had risked everything to protect her people. She was Silvera, and for the first time since he had landed on Velthoria, he knew his answer. He smiled. "Yeah, I think I will." Silvera smirked. "Good. I'd hate to have to hunt you down." Ethan laughed. For the first time since this madness began, he wasn't running. He had found something worth staying for.